Retirement strategy, does your company have one? Does it want one? Is that a difficult question? Yes, I think it probably is. And I think actually, more to the point, there's a whole series of different questions that sit underneath that. Questions such as, when might someone be going to retire? When should they retire? When do they want to retire? How are they going to fund their retirement? Is it going to be a phased retirement? What steps do employers need to take? There's many things which probably were always difficult to pin down, but maybe actually in the world we are today, have just become a whole lot more difficult for people to actually navigate and feel secure about. And actually, it's often some of the emotions that underpin the decisions around a retirement that actually, as an individual, quite how to plan for this major, major life event. Now, some of those questions have, as I say, been around a long time. Some are newer, and one that I'm certainly, when I talk to peers, hear a lot more about now is linked to the Great Retirement. It's actually a lot more time is being spent worrying about skill shortages. It's actually less focused on how do we take the employee and give them a suitable glide path towards the point when they retire. It's like, how do we manage to have enough skills within our organization? So what does that glide path need to look like for the company, for the employer? A much more important consideration than it was at one point in time. And we do know that, particularly in some industries, there are significant skills shortages at the moment. So the one thing you don't necessarily want to do is to actually have an environment in which so many of your more experienced employees have a good reason to leave, somewhat abruptly. Now, as we'll come on to talk about, we have very changing demographics in the world around us these days. This isn't something that's just happened, but it's something I think that the world is waking up to an extent that is now causing a fair amount of alarm. And you could say that actually what would previously have been tomorrow's problems are now very much today's problems. I think everyone felt there was a ticking bomb out there when it came to retirement and an aging population, but it was always something that could be pushed out to be thought about next week. I think next week has come. I think that's why this is such an important question, and all the questions that sit underneath it, I think now require considerable consideration. Okay, so the slide refers to the perfect storm. I think what we've actually got is a whole series of different headwinds of turbulence, and mean that we need to certainly buckle up and be ready for quite a difficult journey ahead. Because if you look at the situation now for employees, the risk has been well and truly passed across to them. And actually what you're seeing is both employers and government, to a large extent, deciding to look in the other direction, walk away, and leave all of the investment risk, longevity risk, frankly, sitting basically with the employee. We have an ever-increasing number of people who, at the moment, if they actually do the analysis, and of course many people are just choosing not to do the analysis, but if they do the analysis and they're realistic about it, they don't have enough funds for a comfortable retirement, certainly not for the sort of retirement they would always imagine for themselves. We're seeing these low investment returns that mean that even if people think that they had, or thought that they had an opportunity to actually achieve significant return in the later years of employment, they're realizing that actually the opportunity to grow their investment is minimal. And from an employer perspective, as I said, you have this problem with the aging population. We've got the skill shortages. We actually now have a scenario where they need to respond far more quickly to what's going on in the world around them. And actually, if you do keep the aging workforce in the workplace for longer now, are they the right people to respond to that challenge? Now, actually, many are, but I think stereotypically, a lot of employees think they're not. And actually, one of the things that isn't happening enough is there's still not enough investment in training and development for the older employee, because it's assumed that they maybe don't have another 3 or 4 roles within them. within the organization. And so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy then that they don't necessarily have the emerging skills that are required, and hence they get marginalized, and they're more likely then to think about going off and doing something else if they have the option. Now, governments are dealing with a scenario now where, as we'll come on to talk about in terms of the dependency ratio, we've got a situation where we are now seeing impacts coming through the economic stagnation, coming through also from the demographics of falling tax revenue. We're seeing increased cost around pensions, around healthcare. And at the end of the day, the numbers are not adding up. And so there's a gap. And we also have that gap at a time when there are significant, investment requirements coming through, partly if we think about the environment and we think about carbon net zero, that's going to require massive investment by government, but also post-COVID investment is required. And where's that money going to come from if we're actually seeing tax revenues not being maximized and falling? So it's a very difficult scenario with no one obviously being in a good place to solve it all and to come to the rescue. Demographic challenge. We're in a situation now where, compared to 2 or 3 decades ago, there's a significant difference in the balance between those who are in the workplace who are fully productive and those who are maybe dependent upon them. That's come about in part because of a lot of social policies that have been around for quite a while. Social policies that said that rising life expectancy was good. Social policies that said that falling birth rates were good. I mean, actually, therefore, we have this massive, in our population coming through now, and those of full working age that are going to be left to pay for the healthcare, for the pensions of this population, not just in this country, but in many Western markets and indeed other markets globally, where that is a huge gap. And if you look here at this slide, what you'll see is that the ratio of the old age to those of working age, so that's, for this purpose, is taken as those who are over the age of 65, and comparing that to those between the ages of 20 and 64, the ratio has gone up significantly. So today, if you take the example of the UK, we're at around just over 30. Well, we were in the mid-20s, 20 years ago. That's quite a big difference if you actually think about it, because that means the population who are dependent has also grown. And the individuals who are then able to contribute to the economy, that shrunk. And where's that burden? That's ultimately, governments are not able to take that. They can't necessarily just wave the proverbial magic wand and make that problem go away. So what we need to accept is the fact that this trend is actually going to get worse. So if you look at those trend lines, you'll see 2020 is around the middle of the graph. You'll see that over the next 25 years, those ratios are going to move quite significantly. And there's a statistic quoted there that China's working age population is set to shrink by 33 million by the end of this decade. At the same time as obviously their aging population in retirement is going to grow. So big challenges, and at the same time, what are we seeing with GDP? Well, when you actually look at this, you'll see that where we are at the moment is that we've actually been through a very healthy period of GDP growth. But now it's come down, and we're basically in a position where we're back to where we were before COVID, before the crash. We're back to what was happening a decade ago, and we're going to be just over 1% growth. That's not enough. When you look at some of the the movement in terms of the bills that the government are going to have to pay, that economies are going to have to cover, that's not enough. It's not even, frankly, enough to fully cover the carbon net zero bill. So where does pension sit on that agenda? Now, in the room outside, I was talking to some colleagues before this, and we were reflecting on the fact that in the same way that with something like ESG actually had its day, and it was actually rising in importance, and then it was almost taken off the front pages, and now it's coming back again, but we've lost time. In the same way, this issue with the aging workforce, we've been distracted. We've been distracted by COVID. We've been distracted by other major world events in the last decade. On the low, everyone knew we had an aging workforce. Frankly, it's been ticking the clock, and nothing's been happening. And now we're at the position where, as I said earlier, I think we're very much looking at a scenario where tomorrow's problem is today's problem. Now, healthcare costs are going to outstrip GDP growth, and we need an average of an extra 2.6% of GDP by 2030. That's just to meet those healthcare costs. And what you'll see is that we've had a nice line, and basically it was fine. Everyone could retire earlier. We had a life of leisure. We were being promised everything was good. What are we seeing now? Obviously, governments have to reduce costs. They need to increase revenue. They actually want to keep people in the workplace for longer. That's quite a significant turnaround to see those lines moving up again. But that is the least that's necessary. And the question is, how do you do that when at the same time we have the Great Retirement? It's all very well government policy being, we actually want to see that trend line continue. But if some people are voting with their feet and saying, well, you may want me to work, but I'm not going to, and I'm maybe one of those who would be more productive in the workplace, but I've got choices. So let's face it, some of those choosing the Great Retirement are those who maybe feel that personally they have more choice. They are probably just the people that we actually want to keep in the workplace for longer. There's also a comment on the slide here about the difference between life expectancy and healthy life expectancy. I'll give you an example of that. If you compare, say, countries such as the Scandinavian markets and compare those with Southern Europe, what you will actually see is that the Southern Europeans live longer. So anyone who's advocated the Mediterranean diet or whatever other reason you use to explain it, that is fact. However, they don't remain healthy for as long. So you actually have an aging population, but also one that's more dependent on the healthcare systems. So again, you get two hits against the economy, and where's that money coming from? And if we're actually going to see in some of those markets the same sort of trends when it comes to dependency ratios, which we are, then those systems are only going to come under increasing pressure. The retirement income gap, this slide basically just demonstrates the decline of DB pension plans. And I think everyone's aware of the fact that sector, the move has been. And lastly, what does it mean when you actually bring it down to a micro level? Now, what this slide shows is the percentage of household income from benefits and pensions, so basically that come from either the state or from some other source of retirement income, because the private pensions are included in the blue line here, blue bar. What this shows is there's quite a difference between the percentage of income that actually comes from those sources if you're, say, in London or the Southeast, than if you are in, say, the northeast of England or Wales. If there's a very high dependency on retirement income, on benefits in those regions, and if we're actually going to see pensions come under more and more pressure, and people certainly, if they are not in state systems, but if they are in private systems but have not necessarily invested enough, what you're going to see is you're going to see much lower disposable income in some of those regions, which, you know, in terms of the microeconomy, is going to put so much pressure on the economies in those areas. Then you look at that and, you know, if you're in London, you might say, well, it doesn't look like so much of a problem. But there's still going to be an impact there. You know, this is something that's going to impact the whole of the UK. But certainly in some areas, there's going to be a further headwind that comes here that will actually challenge significantly the progress that, you know, otherwise might be made. And this is just going to be another you know, reason why some businesses will struggle, why there'll be lower tax revenues. The whole cycle, not careful, will be perpetuated and will continue because of the fact that you know, there just isn't enough economic activity. So, should we feel worried? I think we should feel worried. I think that there's a lot to be concerned about. And where is the burden now sitting for this? Who's going to solve it? Well, like it or not, employers are going to have to step into part of this space. And whether that's through actually taking direct action in terms of the way that they prepare their employees for retirement, the arrangements they put in place, be it the pensions, be it the financial education, be it the other support that goes around helping people as they think about that transition, or be it actually just through thinking how they can best drive their business and ultimately contribute the most they can to the economy, UK PLC is going to have to play a significant part in resolving this problem.